You're listening to The Pulse on AMI Audio. I'm Grant Hardy. Krista Carr is Chief Executive Officer of Inclusion Canada, an organization which works to advance inclusion and human rights for people with intellectual disabilities. Last time we spoke in March, the United Nations Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities had just taken place in Geneva. And now the committee has concluded its review of the combined second and third periodic report of Canada, basically highlighting how Canada is doing on some critical disability rights issues. We join Krista now for an update. Krista, thank you so much for joining us on The Pulse.
Thanks so much for having me.
So now that the committee has wrapped up sort of its review, that final report has come out. What is standing out to you?
Well, I think the committee has, certainly released its concluding observations, and I would say there are some pretty stern warnings, or certainly some observations about how Canada is doing in implementing the convention, and it's quite striking in a number of areas. And I think so. The community, from a disability community organization perspective, we're quite pleased to see that the committee has recognized some of the areas where Canada needs to improve and has come out quite strongly on those areas as well.
And we're definitely going to get into a few specific areas, but I'm just wondering if anything really sticks out, like some of the most strong worded or those areas where the committee struck you as being the most stern or concerned. Is there anything that is coming to mind as really standing out?
Well, certainly the track 2 medical assistance in dying. The committee was very clear that it is discriminatory, it violates the convention, and that track 2 needs to be repealed, that there must be no further expansion of medical assistance in dying in Canada. And so, very, very strong, clear language around that. Certainly in other areas, you will see for the call for closing sheltered workshops, making sure that people have the right to live in community with support, so closing institutions and other types of institutional type facilities for people with disabilities. So some really strong language. Income support. They recognize that the Canada Disability Benefit is a good thing. It's good that the federal government has decided to take this up, but that it will not go far enough to lift people with disabilities out of poverty, and that more needs to be done.
So we're going to touch on definitely all of those issues. I want to talk about medical assistance in dying first, because it's just such a significant issue in Canada related to disability rights. The name Track 2 MAiD is very interesting, literally a separate track for a separate demographic group of people. Can you just remind us what Track 2 MAiD is, first of all?
Right. So Track 1 MAiD, which is where we started with medical assistance in dying in Canada, is for people who are dying. Their death is reasonably foreseeable. They have a terminal illness. They're suffering intolerably, and they want to control the timing of their death. Track 2 MAiD was introduced later. It is a very separate track only for people with disabilities who are not at end of life. So they are not terminally ill. They are not, their death is not reasonably foreseeable, but they are facing intolerable suffering. And I kind of use that with air quotes because we know that people with disabilities, intolerable suffering is not caused by disability, and it's caused by all the societal inequity that they face, the poverty, the lack of housing, the institutionalization, the lack of employment opportunities, the lack of disability-related supports, the marginalization, the stigmatization, the social isolation, all of it, the loneliness, all of those things that people with disabilities experience at much greater rates than the general population. is what causes them intolerable sufferings. But we've decided that rather than tackling those issues and trying to fix those issues, we've said, well, for this particular group of people and only for this particular group of people, we will give them a fast track to a lethal injection, and call it a right to autonomy. So it's highly, highly problematic.
Committee experts asked some good questions for sure from the sounds of it in Geneva. They highlighted concerns over the increase in individuals exercising track 2, the secrecy of the process, questioned whether MAiD is available to people just with sensory disabilities, and really questioned whether people are just choosing MAiD for the accessibility of the process itself, which is essentially what seems to be the case. I think it's fair to say that Canada's response has been pretty unapologetic or vague to these concerns. Would you agree with that?
I do agree with that. I was in the room when the questions were asked to Canada. So I was in Geneva in the room when the questions were asked. And another question that very poignantly got posed to the Canadian government was, how do you possibly justify Track 2 MAiD as not being state-sponsored eugenics? That question never got answered at all. And what we found was that rather than answering the questions directly, particularly on this particular issue, people read from a prepared text. They basically read directly from the legislation or pre-prepared answers that really didn't answer the questions that the committee members were asking, and committee members were you could tell very frustrated by that.
Certainly, it seems like when you are very loud and proud about your political opinion, people like to talk a lot. Sometimes the committee has to shut them down for, speaking too long on a certain subject. When you read from just a prepared statement and you don't really seem to have a lot of answers to questions that are being asked, it feels a little bit, feels like there's a little bit of guilt in the room, maybe.
Certainly, they were not going to deviate from their prepared script, that's for sure. And it was sort of, this is what we're doing, and we're giving people their autonomous, right to choose. Of course, not pointing out the fact that there's only one group of people offered this special choice. So it was challenging. The actual whole appearance was challenging from the perspective that even at the end, the committee members sort of said to Canada, like, this is called a constructive dialogue because it's supposed to be a dialogue. In other words, we ask questions, you answer the questions, we have a conversation, we go back and forth. And you could tell they were quite frustrated by the fact that questions were not always answered directly, and they were often read from prepared scripts and texts that where they may have, the government may have anticipated what questions might get asked, and hence sort of wrote some stuff up, and that's what got answered no matter what the question was. And that certainly was the situation on the conversation around assisted suicide.
I was very impressed that the committee asked the question specifically about whether individuals with sensory disabilities would be eligible under this program. I took a fairly good look, and I'm reasonably certain that question was not answered.
I didn't hear it answered.
Yeah. So in 2027, the government has said that it will remove the temporary exemption for Track 2 MAiD from people with mental illnesses, including depression and personality disorders. Do you have thoughts on what we can expect their review to look like between now and removing that exemption, or just in general, what we should be thinking about what updated Track 2 MAiD will look like?
So, right as it stands right now, the legislation says that MAiD for mental illness as a sole condition will come into effect in 2027, as you say, Grant. And there is no review process that's going to happen between now and then. They've basically said they've extended the deadline in order to give the provinces more time to get ready for this expansion. Certainly, many of the provinces got together and wrote to the federal health minister, the ministers in the provinces and territories, the health ministers, and said, we're not in any position to implement this right now. Our services and supports for people with mental illness aren't where they need to be. We're not in a position to be implementing anything like this right now, which is why the extension got put in place. But to my knowledge, there will be no process between now and then. It's just a matter of giving more time for people to get their systems, quote unquote, in order to be able to administer MAiD for mental illness starting in 2027. Now, given that we have the concluding observations from the UN, and given that those concluding observations say no further expansion, full repeal of Track 2 and no further expansion, it's going to be really interesting to see what Canada does with that, if anything.
Yeah, that's what I'm kind of curious about. I recall certainly your position was a repeal of Track 2 MAiD, given that it really violates Article 10 of the Convention, which is the right to life. Now we have some very strong recommendations from the committee. I know we don't really have a crystal ball here. Don't mean to put you under pressure, but do you have an idea what things might look like, how we're going to move forward from this?
Well, I mean, the disability community will continue to advocate, and now we'll use the concluding observations. I mean, Canada did sign on and ratify the convention, which means it is supposed to be bound by it. Now we know that international law doesn't completely dictate what happens. Mm-hmm. And so it will be interesting to see. We do have a quote unquote new government, a new prime minister. So we'll see what effect, if any, the concluding observations have on what the current government does with medical assistance in dying as it currently exists, or whether or not it influences any future expansion of medical assistance in dying. And we don't know that yet. We just don't know.
Almost everybody will have a disability at some point in their life, or will be touched by it in some way. But it does seem that people with disabilities in general have fairly a little political capital, or that the political will just doesn't seem to be there for making some significant change on these issues. So I'm just kind of curious. I guess I'm just curious what we should do. It's fantastic that we have advocacy organizations like yours out there, and I think that's going to be the brunt of the work certainly going forward. But do you kind of have an idea where to take this advocacy next?
Yeah, it's a super good question, Grant, and one that I sit and scratch my head about on a regular basis. I mean, people with disabilities, just general people, all people with disabilities, I mean, represent up to 27% of the Canadian population. That's a huge chunk of people. And then you have, as you mentioned, people that are touched by it in some way. So their friends, their family members, their allies, of people with disabilities. Mm-hmm. Yet, we can't seem to figure out how to turn that into political clout. We just get ignored and ignored and ignored and ignored and more ignored. Yet, you take a population like seniors, which represents 19% of the population, or you take pick another group of people, and they seem to have much more political weight than we have as a sector. And I'm not sure what exactly to do about that. But what I would say is it isn't going to just be disability organizations all of on and of their own that are going to be able to turn the tide, either on this particular issue or to move forward on so many other issues that we need to move forward on. We're going to need to galvanize all the people with disabilities across this country and their family members and their allies, and really push hard. I mean, we do have a brand new government, and governments respond to their constituents. And so I just keep saying to people, send your emails, reach out, ask for meetings, go visit the constituency office, write your letters, do your thing, and get more people to do the same. And certainly, as disability organizations who have some resources, not many, but some, we will do our work too. We'll still keep on slogging it out. But if we could do this by ourselves, we'd have figured it out by now, and we clearly have not.
It's going to be really important to stick together and advocate as best as possible. Certainly, I think looking at just the sheer number of people who would be eligible for MAiD as the Track 2 MAiD as the years go by into 2027, hopefully society will just recognize that we are going way too far and we need to stop with Track 2 MAiD.
I don't know. What I worry about is that the longer it goes on, the more it becomes normalized. And the more it entrenches this idea in the heads of the general population, which everybody loves to talk about how many Canadians in the general population support this or support that. I feel like it will further entrench, either consciously or unconsciously, this idea in people's minds that people with disabilities are better off dead. And if I ever have one, I'll be better off dead. And that really worries me. It keeps me awake at night because, we know, obviously, that isn't the case. But the longer this goes on and the more normalized it becomes, the more worried I get about that. The other thing I would say is, to your point, Grant, about how many people this will affect. I mean, we're getting calls now from people with fibromyalgia who are approved under Track 2 MAiD, right? And so, and I'm just using that as one example. So it isn't just like your traditional definitions of disability as you or I might know them to be, right? It's getting very expanded.
Yeah, disability, mental health are all pretty socially constructed, really. There's probably not, with a reckless laws or reckless policies, you certainly could probably push things pretty far, I would think.
Yeah.
So I do want to talk about a couple of other issues, but I just wanted to give you the opportunity first, if you would like to add any other thoughts related to the issue on Track 2 MAiD.
Just that I think now we have another tool at our disposal. So we have something else that we can say, we can take and use as an advocacy tool. It is, in other words, it isn't just us
Yes.
that thinks this is a major problem. We're talking about a United Nations body of people, purposely appointed to oversee the implementation of the convention in those states parties that have ratified it. And they're clearly sending us a message about this being a huge violation of rights. So I think that's something we've got to really take this now and push it forward. So that's the only other thing I'd want to say about that, Grant.
Yeah, that's actually a really reassuring point, in that I think the UN does have a fair amount of credibility still, and it's something that everyone has heard of. So being able to kind of point to that is going to be really useful. Just to talk about some other issues here, I was really surprised to hear that the committee there commended Canada on accessible voting opportunities. Voting is something that I've always found to be incredibly challenging, possibly one of the most challenging civic duties. Curious about your thoughts from your perspective there at Inclusion Canada on how you think we're doing with accessible voting.
So I think what I would say is there's a couple things to keep in mind. One thing is the committee bases its concluding observations on information it gets from government and information it gets from the community and or civil society, as they would like to call it. And I think that they can't be all negative. So I think
Yeah.
they need to try to they like to find some areas where they can sort of say, yeah, okay, like we recognize you're doing some stuff here. So I would agree with you, Grant. It's very difficult. We have made progress around voting. I would say that generally speaking, from where it was, we certainly have made more progress on accessible voting. But you can take, for example, the last election, just for example,
Mhm.
and see that people still face significant challenges in the voting process. So it's definitely a work in progress for sure. And we have miles to go before we sleep.
That is for sure. Also, want to talk about a couple things related to employment. The government of Canada did highlight significant strides in terms of increasing employment for the disability community, including being relatively on target to have 5,000 people with disabilities in the federal government. How do you think we are doing in terms of at least increasing accessible opportunities for gainful employment?
Well, I mean, we certainly run a national employment program and we're having great success with it. So I think, for sure there are positive strides being made in employment. So I'll start by saying that,
Mhm.
but significant barriers still remain for people with disabilities to become gainfully employed and get the support they need to not only get the job, but to keep the job and be supported well on the job. And we still have a lot of barriers to break down around employers, attitudes, all of the sort of things,
Mhm.
that we're struggling with. So while I think the government has put significant effort, particularly during the pandemic and post pandemic, into increasing the employment rates of Canadians with disabilities, for sure, and there has been some successes and some strides made, we really still we can't take our foot off the gas there because there is just still so, if I look at the population that I serve, people with an intellectual disability, so many are confined to day programs,
Mhm.
sheltered workshops, being paid pennies a day, all of those types of things when they could very easily uh, have a job if they had the support to get one and to keep one. And so it's forever a work in progress. We have a lot of work to do there.
100%. Along those lines, I wanted to talk about sheltered workshops, because this was
Mhm.
touched on in the by the committee a little bit. This is something I very naively thought did not happen in our country, where I was proud to think that we had no minimum wage exemptions at all, which some other countries do. However, these sheltered workshops are a thing here. Can you talk about them? What exactly are they, and like how prevalent are they, and how do we eliminate them?
Yeah. So sheltered workshops are sort of um, industries or businesses or that operate under an agency. They're operated by an agency, that typically an agency funded by government, and they operate these programs where they, you know, make pallets and sell them, or they make certain things and they sell them. They sell a service, or they run some sort of a business, but the people with disabilities that work in the business don't actually get paid.
Mhm.
They are just paid a stipend, so $20 a week for 40 hours of work or whatever it is. And the dollars, that the profit from this goes back into the agency. It doesn't go into the hands of the people who are doing the work, and the people without disabilities that are working in those businesses are getting paid minimum wage or better, often quite a bit better than that. And so we do have them still in our country. We have them all over the place. We don't have as many as we used to have, but we still have them, and we still operate them, and the government still funds them. And often they get around some provinces still have minimum wage exemptions. They have exemptions to minimum wage legislation. But in other places, they just get around it by calling it, they call
But,
it by some other name. They don't call it a sheltered
mm,
workshop. They call it, oh, so and so goes to X agency during the day and they get supported there, et cetera, et cetera. And they don't actually call it what it is. And so, unless someone calls it out, complains, files a complaint or something like that, um, they're just allowed to continue to do this. And it does happen in Canada quite regularly.
definitely a bit of, not a bit, but a huge gray area then. So the idea is to call it sort of an activity program, support program, something like that, where you also it happened to get a little bit of money when in reality it is a job that you're not being paid for. Is that kind of the
Right.
idea? Yeah. Okay.
Right. And
Um,
then they say, oh, well, these people can't be as productive as other people, or they're really not doing that much. Or, that's how they sort of justify
mhm, mhm.
what's being done.
So there's a lot more we could talk about, but we're getting short on time. So I just wanted to ask you, obviously, we have a lot of work to do in Canada. Where do you hope Canada will be by the time a next committee meeting takes place?
Oh, I would love to see, that we have really made stride, like that we've taken these concluding observations seriously, that we've implemented an action plan to address them that involves all the provinces and territories and the federal government, not one pointing the finger at the other and saying, well, that's not our job, it's your job, and that's not our job, it's your job, and someone else is supposed to do that. And that we just work together to make society truly inclusive of people with disabilities, and allow them to facilitate the contribution that they all have to make to our society. That's what I would like to see us um, that's what I would like to see us do to move forward. um, am I hopeful that that will happen? I don't know. I live in hope. I remain hopeful. I try to I hope that that's what I would like to see us move forward in that direction.
I do try and think of some of the good things, but we have a lot of areas that need improvement. I'm sure people can follow Inclusion Canada for some updates and to learn about some opportunities for advocacy. And I really appreciate the work you are doing, Krista. And thank you so much for joining us on the Pulse.
Thanks so much for having me, Grant. Anytime.
I really appreciate Krista Carr, CEO of Inclusion Canada, taking the time to talk about the important advocacy they are doing to make Canada more accessible. The Pulse airs on Tuesdays and Thursdays at 1:30 p.m. Eastern on AMI Audio. You can also catch the show on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Grant Hardy, and thank you for listening.